Alabama has executed a man with a first-of-its-kind method using nitrogen gas. Kenneth Eugene Smith pronounced dead at 8:25 p.m. at a state prison. It marked the first time a new execution method had been used since 1982 when lethal injection was introduced. The execution came after a last-minute legal battle in which Smith's attorney said the state had been making him the test subject for an experimental execution method. The attorney also saying it could violate the constitutional ban on cruel and unusual punishment. Smith, one of two men convicted in the 1988 murder for hire slaying of Elizabeth Sennett, the wife of a pastor.
No person to be executed by nitrogen gas. The gas was administered by face mask. It caused inmate Kenneth Smith to die by oxygen deprivation. Media witnesses say he appeared to shake uncontrollably before he was pronounced dead. This is the first time a new execution method was used in the U.S. since 1982 when lethal injection was introduced. Alabama tried to execute Smith back in 2022 by lethal injection, but authorities couldn't find a serviceable vein.
And the Department of Corrections and the Attorney General's office have assured us that all the protocols are in place and it will be safe.
Kenneth Smith made some bad decisions 35 years ago, and his debt was paid.
Smith was on death row after he was convicted of getting a $1,000 payment for killing a woman in 1988, murder for hire. Death penalty opponents say nitrogen gas executions are inhumane and a form of torture.
First time in U.S. history, a state has killed a death row inmate by nitrogen gas.
It's a method Nebraska is contemplating since lethal injection drugs have proven hard to come by. Bill Shammer's on the live desk.
Rob, Julie, let's start with the Alabama case. This is Kenneth Smith. He killed Elizabeth Sennett in 1988 in a murder for hire plot. A last-minute effort to the Supreme Court to pause the execution was denied around 7 o'clock tonight. At 8:25 p.m., he was executed by nitrogen hypoxia.
This should not be a moment that passes with a shrug or a fleeting news report. If the people of Alabama are going to smother someone to death, then they should be forced to think about it.
Nothing happened here today is going to bring Mom back. Nothing. It's kind of a bittersweet day.
Smith's last words were, "Tonight, Alabama causes humanity to take a step backwards." According to witnesses, the execution took about 20 minutes. He was awake for several minutes, seen shaking at times, grabbing his restraints, and breathing heavy for several minutes. This method of execution is also approved in Oklahoma and Missouri, but this is the first time it's been used in the U.S. In Nebraska, Senator Lauren Lippincott has proposed a bill to give the state two options. Quote, "A sentence of death shall be enforced by either lethal injection or nitrogen hypoxia, with the method to be determined by the department. The execution shall be carried in compliance with an execution protocol." It has 17 co-sponsors, but so far no hearing date. Nebraska currently has 11 people on death row. Only one person has been executed in the last 25 years. That was Carrie Dean Moore in 2018. Back to you.
Thank you, Bill.
5:02, and let's get to our national headlines. To Alabama's controversial execution of a convicted murderer who spent decades on death row. 58-year-old Kenneth Smith was put to death using nitrogen gas.
One state official calling it a humane method of execution, but critics disagree. ABC's Lionel Moyes has the story.
The state of Alabama executing death row inmate Kenneth Smith overnight, marking the first time in U.S. history nitrogen gas was used to carry out capital punishment.
Smith was pronounced deceased by physicians at 8:25 p.m. Central Standard Time.
The Supreme Court had denied an appeal in a 6-3 decision, with the liberal justices dissenting. Justice Sotomayor accusing Alabama of experimenting with human life, saying having failed to kill Smith on its first attempt, Alabama has selected him as its guinea pig to test a method of execution never attempted before. Smith was one of 3 men convicted in the murder of Elizabeth Sennett in the 1980s. In 2022, Smith and the state of Alabama agreeing to a new form of execution after the state botched a lethal injection execution. In a settlement with Smith, the state of Alabama agreeing to not pursue lethal injection again and instead attempt a new method of execution, nitrogen hypoxia. Smith only eating some of his final meal. His last words were, "Tonight, Alabama causes humanity to take a step backwards. I'm leaving with love, peace, and light." Nitrogen hypoxia has been controversial, with advocates noting that a version of the method has been used in some assisted suicides in Europe. Lawyers for the state argue that the method is painless, with unconsciousness occurring in a matter of seconds. But the United Nations Human Rights Office called on Alabama to stop the execution, noting there is no scientific evidence to prove that execution by nitrogen inhalation will not cause grave suffering. Alabama says it will continue to use the method.
Nitrogen hypoxia is one of the 3 methods of execution, so if the inmates choose it, then that's the method we will use.
Lionel Moise, ABC News, New York.
Mississippi and Oklahoma have authorized their prisons to carry out executions with nitrogen if they cannot use lethal injections, but they have never tried to do so.
Back to the breaking news we told you about at the top of this newscast. Kenneth Smith has been executed, the Alabama prisoner becoming the first person in this country to be put to death using a process called nitrogen hypoxia.
The official time of death, 8:25 this evening. The second time the state tried to execute Smith for the murder for hire of Elizabeth Sennett in 1988. The first attempt in 2022 had to be stopped because of a problem with the lethal injection.
Fox News' Brendan Kirby now joining us live from Atmore, where the execution took place there in Holman Prison. Brendan, give us the latest.
Well, Byron and Lenise, there was a lot of opposition to this execution because, as you mentioned, the method that was used, the nitrogen hypoxia, had never been tried before. Governor Kay Ivey sending us this statement. On March 18, 1988, 45-year-old Elizabeth Sennett's life was brutally taken from her by Kenneth Eugene Smith. After more than 30 years and attempt after attempt to game the system, Mr. Smith has answered for his horrendous crimes. The execution was lawfully carried out by nitrogen hypoxia, the method previously requested by Mr. Smith as an alternative to lethal injection. At long last, Mr. Smith got what he asked for, and this case can finally be put to rest. I pray that Elizabeth Sennett's family can receive closure after all these years dealing with this great loss. The execution came after the U.S. Supreme Court denied one last-ditch effort by his attorneys to stop it. Although Smith chose nitrogen hypoxia as the alternative when he challenged lethal injection in court, death penalty opponents described that as a Hobson's choice that he made under duress without fully understanding what the process would involve. The Department of Corrections reports that Smith's last meal was steak, hash browns, and eggs. He wasn't allowed to eat solid foods past 10 a.m. He was allowed to drink liquids up until 4 p.m. And we're getting some reaction from this. We are learning from Sennett's family that they say this is a bittersweet day for them. And I also just spoke with the defendant's spiritual advisor. He tells me that Mr. Smith appeared to suffer in the execution chamber. He described it as horrific, and he's about to have a news conference. We have to bring you some of that coming up at Fox 10 News at 10. Reporting live in Atmore, Brendan Kirby, Fox 10 News.
Kenneth Smith made a lengthy final statement. It began with, "Tonight, Alabama caused humanity to take a step backward." He continued saying, "I'm leaving with love, peace, and light. Thank you for supporting me. Love all of you."
Some of the last words of a condemned man were read out loud after his execution. The state of Alabama executed Kenneth Smith for the 1988 murder of a pastor's wife. It was the first time nitrogen hypoxia was used as a method of execution. Witnesses and supporters of Smith called it inhumane.
What we saw was minutes of someone struggling for their life. We saw minutes of someone heaving back and forth. We saw spit We saw all sorts of stuff from his mouth develop on the mask. We saw this mask tied to the gurney and him ripping his head forward over and over and over again.
But the children of the victim tell local media they were for the execution and hoped it would bring them the closure they've been seeking for more than 30 years.
I mean, I feel so sorry for the Stinnett family tonight. That this is how the state decided they were going to honor Elizabeth Stinnett's memory.
This was the state's second attempt at executing Smith after an unsuccessful lethal injection in 2022. For Inside Edition Digital, I'm Mara Montalbano.
The U.S. state of Alabama has carried out the first known execution of a death row inmate by suffocation with nitrogen gas. Kenneth Smith, a convicted murderer, was put to death after the Supreme Court again denied a last-minute appeal. The method had never been tried before, and Smith's lawyers had argued that it amounted to cruel and unusual punishment. Well, the Commissioner of Alabama's Department of Corrections, John Hamm, gave details of the execution at a news conference.
At 7:53 Central Time tonight, the state of Alabama started carrying out the execution of Kenneth Eugene Smith by nitrogen hypoxia at the William C. Holman Correctional Facility in Atmore. Smith was executed for the 1988 capital murder of Elizabeth Dorleen Sennett in Colbert County. Please confer with the media witnesses for Smith's last words. Smith was pronounced deceased by physicians at 8:25 p.m. Central Standard Time.
And that was the Commissioner of Alabama's Department of Corrections, John Hamm, speaking earlier. Well, after the execution, a number of witnesses addressed the media and described what had happened.
Once the execution began, within a couple of minutes, Kenny began to violently push against the straps. His head began to move back and forth violently. This was the fifth execution that I've witnessed in Alabama, and I have never seen such a violent reaction to an execution.
Well, Charles Sennett, whose mother Elizabeth was murdered by Kenneth Smith, also gave his reaction to the execution.
Nothing happened here today is going to bring Mom back. Nothing. It's kind of a bittersweet day. We're not going to be jumping around, hooping and hollering, hooray and all that. That's not us. But we're glad this day is over.
Well, let's discuss this further. I'm joined now by our North America correspondent, David Willis, who's speaking to us today from Washington. Hello there to you, David. First off, what reaction has there been to this execution in the United States?
Well, depending on who you listen to, LaQuessa, there are those on the Alabama state side who are saying that this was carried out in accordance with the plans that have been in place for some while. Whilst, as you just heard there are others who are saying that this was quite a long and tortuous death for this man, Kenneth Smith. Now, we heard from the Alabama state governor, Kay Ivey, who said that after more than 30 years, an attempt after attempt to, as she put it, game the system on the part of Kenneth Smith, he had answered, as she put it, for his horrendous crimes. And her statement concluded, LaQuessa, by saying, "I pray that Elizabeth Sennett's family can receive closure after all these years dealing with what she called in the statement that great loss." But this is, of course, a highly controversial means of execution. Kenneth Smith had dodged a previous attempt to execute him more than a year ago after officials in Alabama failed to find a vein through which to administer a lethal injection. And there had been various appeals lodged over the planned execution tonight with the U.S. Supreme Court, the highest court in the land. They were all rejected. And not long after the word came down that those appeals had been rejected, came the news that Kenneth Smith had been put to death at 8:25 p.m. this evening, local time in Alabama.
And David, how is it that nitrogen was used for this execution?
Well, what this procedure entails is pumping nitrogen gas into a mask which covers the face, and the inmate is there, the prisoner is therefore made to inhale this nitrogen gas, and basically they are deprived, the body is deprived of oxygen. But we heard, didn't we, from some of the eyewitnesses to tonight's execution who told of Mr. Smith twisting and turning on the gurney, gasping for breath, and spending several minutes alive before this lethal dose of nitrogen gas had overpowered him. There will be a lot of questions, obviously, of how how successful or otherwise, if one can put it that way, this method turned out to be. And currently, of course, all we have is the word of those small number of people who were admitted into the execution chamber in Alabama tonight, LaQuessa, to witness what happened.
The US state of Alabama has executed a convicted murderer using nitrogen gas. One Supreme Court judge said that the killer for hire, Kenneth Eugene Smith, had been selected as a guinea pig to test a new method of execution. Our correspondent in the US, Martha Kellner, reports.
In a small town in rural Alabama, this man, Kenneth Eugene Smith, died in a way no human being ever has. He was executed using nitrogen gas, an untested method, he a human guinea pig. Strapped to a gurney with a mask placed over his face, state experts claimed he'd be unconscious in 40 seconds. But witnesses say Smith writhed and thrashed for between 2 and 4 minutes and breathed heavily for another 5.
What we saw was minutes of someone struggling for their life. We saw minutes of someone heaving back and forth. We saw spit. We saw all sorts of stuff from his mouth develop on the mask. We saw this mask tied to the gurney and him ripping his head forward over and over and over again.
The state of Alabama, nevertheless, hailed it a success.
He struggled against his restraints a little bit, but there's some involuntary movement and some agonal breathing, so that was all expected and is in the side effects that we've seen or researched on nitrogen hypoxia.
His lawyer's last-minute appeal to stop the execution was denied. They had argued this was a cruel and unusual punishment. Smith had already endured a botched attempt at a lethal injection. In 2022, an executioner tried unsuccessfully for 4 hours to find a vein. This and several other failed lethal injections, the state of Alabama says, necessitates finding a new method. In his final statement, Smith said, "Tonight, Alabama caused humanity to take a step backward. I'm leaving with love, peace and light. Thank you for supporting me. Love all of you." It was in 1988 that Smith killed Elizabeth Sennett, paid $1,000 by her husband, a pastor, to be a hitman. 34 years later, as the curtain closes on Smith, a new frontier potentially for how America executes its death row prisoners.
Well, let's bring in Martha, who joins us live now. And Martha, your report there ended on the line that it was a new frontier potentially, and the Attorney General in Alabama said this offered a blueprint to other states. But at the same time, public opinion is shifting on the death penalty in the United States, is it not?
Yeah, the US remains an outlier in the Western world, Gareth. It is the only fully developed country in the Western world to continue to support the death penalty. Last year, 24 people in the United States were executed, more than half of those in Texas and Florida, despite, as you say, public opinion turning against it. 3 states now, Alabama, Oklahoma and Mississippi, support the use or have approved the use of nitrogen gas as an execution method. Alabama pursuing alternative methods after several botched attempts at lethal injections, including, as I was alluding to in my report there, a particularly nasty botched attempt on Kenneth Smith, the man who was killed today. Despite varying recollections of his final moments, his Supporters say that he suffered deeply in his final minutes, whereas the Department of Corrections in Alabama, which pursued this death penalty, they say this all went to plan and they were expecting exactly what they saw happen. Despite those varying recollections, it is likely that other states will follow, not least because the drugs which are used in lethal injection are becoming harder to come by with pharmaceutical companies in relation to both availability and price. So it is likely that this could be a new frontier for executions in America.
So I need some assurance that this is safe.
Outside the state capitol building in Alabama, protesters have already gathered, hoping for a last-minute reprieve. At the Holman Correctional Facility, Kenneth Eugene Smith is scheduled to be killed by nitrogen in a 30-hour time period from today. The US state has authorized a plan to suffocate Mr. Smith by strapping an airtight mask over his face and forcing him to inhale pure nitrogen. That, in turn, would starve his body of oxygen. Alabama's Solicitor General said this is the most painless and humane method of execution known to man. But this has been denounced by some medical professionals who warn it could cause a range of catastrophic mishaps. And the United Nations is concerned too. They said it could amount to torture and have called for a halt. Veterinary authorities in the US and Europe advised against nitrogen hypoxia, as it's known for most mammals. This isn't even the first time that Alabama authorities have tried to execute Kenneth Smith, who was convicted for the 1988 murder of Elizabeth Sennett. They attempted to kill him by lethal injection, but had to abandon that after they couldn't find a vein. He said that's left him with post-traumatic stress, and he's frightened about how his next execution will go. With the eyes of the world on Alabama, one of the main questions being asked about this is why?
Well, Alabama has identified an alternate method of execution, I think chiefly because it has had great difficulty using the most commonly form of execution, which is lethal injection. Alabama in the summer of 2022 botched 3 executions in a row, including one that was scheduled for Mr. Smith himself. So this is his second time in the execution chamber.
And this alternate method of nitrogen, what do we know about it and what do we know about its purpose?
Well, what we know about it is what Alabama has chosen to share with us, and they have kept many of the details of the protocol secret. But the broad outlines are that a face mask will be fitted over Mr. Smith's nose and mouth, and he will be forced to breathe pure nitrogen gas. That will eventually result in organ failure and his death. Now, that is the theory behind use of this method, but it has never been used before, so really no one knows what's going to happen.
The Alabama Solicitor General said that this is the most painless and humane way to execute someone. What do you think of that statement?
Well, I'm curious about how he knows that. I mean, the medical experts and the physicians that have looked at this and scientists all have a number of concerns about how this will be used. For example, if that mask fitted over Mr. Smith's nose and mouth, if it becomes dislodged for any reason, that will affect the flow and the amount of gas, and that could prolong his death and his suffering. And there are other concerns about the safety of people in the chamber themselves. There's a religious advisor that will be present with him and prison guards who may be affected by the nitrogen gas. Now, use of nitrogen gas is not permitted by veterinary associations. They understand that use of the gas could cause panic in animals, and it would be a cruel way to euthanize them. So it's very bewildering how Alabama has settled on this particular procedure.
And what about pharmaceutical companies as well? Have they been worried about the use of their drugs in executions like this?
Well, that's right. Pharmaceutical companies, when they learned their drugs were being used in executions in the United States, many of them responded by withdrawing their drugs from the market or refusing to sell them to prisons.
Only 5 states have carried out capital punishment in the last year. So what does that say about American attitudes towards the death penalty in general?
Yes. Well, you know, what is happening in Alabama is not reflective of what is happening in the United States. The majority of the states in the United States have chosen not to use the death penalty. There are not executions or new death sentences. The use is really isolated in just a handful of states, and Alabama has identified this procedure on its own initiative and for its own reasons, but I do not think there are any broad conclusions that should be drawn about how the American public feels about this.
And Robin, just finally, if it goes ahead and works, what could happen next?
Well, just because, and I hope sincerely for Mr. Smith's sake, that all of our fears do not result in a gruesome death for him. If he is successfully executed with this drug and using this protocol, that does not mean that the next execution using the same protocol would go the same way. There are so many risks and so many inherent problems with this protocol. I don't think other states will want to take on the same kind of risks that Alabama is doing by using this protocol. So I would hope that this might be the last time we see the use of nitrogen gas.
Robin Mayer, thank you very much for your time indeed. Thank you.
Let's get back to the big breaking news we brought you in the last hour. The state of Alabama has executed its first prisoner with nitrogen gas. Kenneth Smith was put to death at 8:25 p.m. local time there for the 1988 death of Elizabeth Sennett. This execution marks the first time in the U.S. that the controversial method of nitrogen hypoxia was used. Josh Gaunt from our Fox affiliate in Birmingham, WBRC, he is joining us live now down there from Alabama with more on this execution. Josh.
Yeah, good evening. As you mentioned about an hour ago, Kenneth Smith was pronounced dead by the state of Alabama, as we mentioned, by using nitrogen hypoxia, the first death row inmate here in the country to be executed using this method. According to Corrections Commissioner John Hamm, who spoke to the media just a short time ago, he said there wasn't anything out of the ordinary that happened here, and he says it took place in his estimation. This execution took place in his estimation according to plan, but he did say that Smith appeared to be holding his breath at the beginning when they started this execution. According to the 5 media witnesses who saw this, they say it appeared Kenneth Smith was conscious for several minutes into this execution. They say he shook and writhed on the gurney, then eventually took several deep breaths before his breathing started to slow down. As we mentioned, he was pronounced dead a short time later by the state of Alabama at 8:25 Central Time here in Atmore at Holman Correctional Facility. Attorney General for the state of Alabama, Steve Marshall, says this execution proved to be an effective and humane method of execution. Shortly after the Corrections Commissioner spoke to members of the media, we heard from Elizabeth Sennett's family. She was the pastor's wife that was killed back in the late 80s up in North Alabama in a murder-for-hire plot. Her pastor, husband at the time, ordered this hit, if you will. Kenneth Smith and another man were caught up in this. According to Alabama law, they are sort of just as guilty as being caught, as they were caught up in this whole situation. So that's why he is on death row. According to Elizabeth Sennett's son, Mike, he says that this is a bittersweet day for their family. He says that evil deeds have consequences, and they say that justice has been served for their mother. Once again, Kenneth Smith, the first death row inmate in the country executed by nitrogen hypoxia by the state of Alabama here at Holman Correctional. That happened around 8:25 Central Time here in Alabama. We'll send it back to you.
Josh, I do have to ask, were you part of the media witnesses that saw this entire execution go down? And can you describe what that was like? It must be very difficult to watch someone be put to death right before your eyes.
Yeah, I wasn't a part of the media witness team this go around. I have witnessed 2 lethal injections, and yes, it is trying to put into words here what that feeling is like. But you were watching the state put someone to death. Now, we haven't spoke to those media witnesses other than they did give a pool report after the corrections commissioner spoke, and they sort of described, what they saw. There are some interesting things I took from that pool report when they said that, he shook and writhed on the gurney. Then he eventually took several deep breaths. But according to the corrections commissioner, those were involuntary. So in other words, those were expected according to the corrections commissioner. I did ask him, because the execution protocol here in Alabama is so secretive, it looks like a CIA document. It is so redacted. Legal experts say it's redacted in some of the most important places, but it talks about how this process is supposed to go. The state initially said that it could, he would fall unconscious within seconds and then dead within minutes. But in this particular case, according to the media witnesses here, that initial step took several minutes. So there are still, questions here. There are a lot of questions going into this execution. There are a lot of questions going out. But as I mentioned, I did ask Corrections Commissioner John Hamm about, how did they prepare for this execution? How did they test this nitrogen hypoxia method? And he did not answer that question. Of course, we will continue to push for answers as it relates to this method of execution, which more inmates could choose to use here in the future.
Josh, just kind of piggybacking off of this last answer that you gave, can you provide some context to our viewers as to how we got to this point? This is the first inmate, as you've been mentioning, that was executed by nitrogen gas, and this is after that failed execution already happened once before.
Yeah, that's right. It's important to note here that he actually requested nitrogen hypoxia at the time that shortly after he received the death sentence. So he requested this, but as you mentioned, there was a failed execution back in 2022. I was here for that, and it took ADOC several hours to be able to do this. They say they ran out of time. At that point, the death warrant expired at midnight. Now the execution protocols say that these executions go until 6 a.m. So they were working up against the clock back then. They were able to set one IV line, but they cannot set a second IV line during his first initial execution attempt. That was called off. Of course, that was 2 or 3 failed executions at that point. The state of Alabama then did an internal review of the process. A lot of people say that review should have been independent, but it was a state review of execution procedures. And then essentially they brought in a team to do the next 2 executions, and there were not any issues, according to the corrections commissioner. And then shortly after that is when they set the death execution date for Kenneth Smith. And then tonight, we're here now where the state of Alabama finally carrying out this nitrogen hypoxia execution. According to the state, it appears everything in their estimation went according to plan.
Josh, we aired the press conference that featured some statements from the victim's family as well as from officials with the Department of Corrections. But did you get to hear anything from Kenneth's family? What are they saying about this whole ordeal?
Yeah, we didn't hear anything from them. They were here to witness this execution, but we only heard from Elizabeth Sennett's family after the corrections commissioner spoke. And as I said earlier, they said it's a bittersweet day for them. They've been waiting 35 years for justice, saying that evil deeds have consequences and that justice has been served for their mother. But as it relates to Kenneth Smith, we haven't heard anything yet from his family. We understand his spiritual advisor and some other folks are holding a press conference either right now or in the next few minutes. And so we may get to hear from some of them there, but so far, nothing from Kenneth Smith's family.
All right, and we'll be looking toward that here at Live Now from Fox. Josh, just finally, this entire case has garnered national attention because of the method of execution. Have you ever covered something like this?
No, to be honest, I haven't. As I mentioned earlier, there were a lot of questions going into this. There are still a lot of questions going out of this. Some of Kenneth Smith's attorneys and some of his other team said, this method was untested, it's unproven, and they felt like it could amount to cruel and unusual punishment. And they were hoping that the state of Alabama, hoping the U.S. Supreme Court would give them a reprieve here, but that did not happen. The Supreme Court denied 2 stays of execution here. Earlier today, the court denied one from a previous case. A federal judge judge said that this execution can proceed. So then Kenneth Smith and his legal team appealed that to the 11th Circuit. The 11th Circuit said that this execution can proceed. So then again, a last-ditch effort here, an 11th hour effort by Kenneth Smith and his team. They appealed it to the U.S. Supreme Court, but later on, a little earlier this evening, right before 7 o'clock, is when we got word that the Supreme Court denied that stay of execution.
Josh Gaunt down there with our Fox affiliate in Birmingham, Alabama, WBRC. We appreciate your time and giving us context on this big national breaking news story. We'll talk again.
Okay, thank you.
In the meantime, I do want to just showcase the final words from Kenneth Smith during that execution, rather. Take a look at this because we do have it here in a posted statement. He said this: "Tonight, Alabama caused humanity to take a step backward. I'm leaving with love, peace, and light. Thank you for supporting me. I love you." And that is, again, from Kenneth Eugene Smith, his final words.
WKRG News 5 starts right now with breaking news.
Good evening. Breaking news tonight in Atmore, where the first ever execution by nitrogen gas was carried out at Holman Prison.
Convicted murderer Kenneth Eugene Smith has been put to death for the 1988 murder for hire of a preacher's wife. Our Blake Brown is live in Atmore with the latest.
Hey, good evening, Roseanne. Smith's wife, 2 kids, and a family friend all witnessed that execution tonight. His spiritual advisor, Reverend Jeff Hood, was actually in the chamber during the process. Now, the time of death was 8:25 tonight. We know that Smith ate his final meal, which consisted of steak, hash browns, and eggs. He also had several visitors stop by throughout the day. Now, tonight, Reverend Hood spoke about those final moments inside the prison walls. He held a press conference with others, including family members, here at the Holiday Inn in Atmore to describe what they observed. The entire process from start to finish took approximately 22 minutes. A few of the things Reverend Hood said that stood out a few moments ago. He said, quote, he was ripping his head forward over and over and over again. Here's a little more from that press conference and what he had to say just a few moments ago.
I think that anybody that witnessed this knows that we didn't see someone go unconscious in 2 or 3 seconds. We didn't see somebody go unconscious in 30 seconds. What we saw was minutes of someone struggling for their life. We saw minutes of someone heaving back and forth. We saw spit. We saw all sorts of stuff from his mouth develop on the mask. We saw this mask tied to the gurney and him ripping his head forward over and over and over again. And we also saw correction officials in the room who were visibly surprised at how bad this thing went. I know that Commissioner Ham, I know that ADOC is going to come out here and say, well, this is what we thought was going to happen. Look at their court filings. This is not what they thought was going to happen.
And again, that press conference continuing right now as we speak inside the Holiday Inn. We're going to get back in there in just a moment. But again, this was the first time a U.S. state has used nitrogen hypoxia on a death row inmate. We hope to hear from the Department of Corrections soon about how they feel this process was handled. And we're told in just a few minutes, Smith's family will speak to the media in just a few moments. So we'll hear what they have to say as well. For now, we're live in Atmore. I'm Blake Brown, WKRG News 5.
A quiet vigil on the steps of Alabama's state capitol, calling for a last-minute stop to this evening's execution of 58-year-old Kenneth Smith.
3 people have been charged with...
Smith was convicted 35 years ago after he was hired to kill a preacher's wife. Critics not only oppose his execution, but are outraged by the new method, untested on humans, nitrogen hypoxia.
I can't think of anything as dehumanizing as saying we're going to use you as a human guinea pig, a human lab rat to kill you.
It is a morbid subject. For Kenneth Smith, it's not the first time he's been strapped to a gurney for execution. 14 months ago, officials tried by lethal injection and couldn't do it properly before time was running out on the execution warrant. This time, it's using a mask, forcing Smith to breathe in nitrogen, a lack of oxygen to bring unconsciousness within seconds and death within minutes. Opponents call it nitrogen suffocation, and some say it's unconstitutional.
I think that the states that want to execute people are thrilled, to see that there may be another method here. But an execution can go forward where a corpse is created, but the method of execution or the technique of the execution causes an unlawful kind of death.
One reason for changing from lethal injections, under public pressure, some drug companies stopped making their products available. Now, one group wants the Quebec-owned U.S. producer of the industrial mask it believes is being used to take similar action.
To try and intervene and ensure that their products are not used to execute Kenneth Smith. Unfortunately, we haven't heard anything from them.
A Catholic charity in Rome decries both the execution and the method.
A new standard of the lowering level of humanity for the whole world, not just for Alabama.
Others feared that time was running out, including Kenneth Smith, who issued a statement asking that people not turn their heads and normalize what is happening. Late this evening, the U.S. Supreme Court denied his final appeal. Eric Sorensen, Global News, Toronto.